Now, comrades, the political debate between Marxism and anarchism is one which has never been characterized by a very high degree of theoretical and intellectual clarity. In the 100 years since Marx's death, the debate between those who accept the ideas of Marx and those who accept the ideas of the anarchist founders has been fierce. At times it has been quite vicious and thoughtless. But it is one in which the issues involved have been primarily assumed rather than stated. Now, there are several reasons for this haziness about the issues in the debate. Firstly, it has to be said that very few Marxists have ever actually read the voluminous works of the political founders of anarchism. To plough through Proudhon's general idea of the revolution and his system of economic contradictions, to read Bakunin's revolutionary catechism, his statism and anarchy, his letters to a Frenchman, to read Max Stirner's The Ego and His Own, to read Kropotkin's Mutual Aid. To go through all of these are very laborious tasks, and noticeably, the people who have very often been the most vociferous in opposing anarchism have been the people who have been the least well-read in any serious analysis of what it said. Now, Karl Marx himself was an exception to this. Of all the works that I mentioned, apart from Kropotkin's Mutual Aid, which was, of course, written after Marx's death, Marx was quite well aware. Marx entered into a brief correspondence with Proudhon. He was well aware from his participation in the First International of Bakunin, and he devoted a large part of his great work, The German Ideology, to the works of Max Stirner. In fact, the whole of the first part is dealing with a refutation of the anarchist principles in Stirner's book, The Ego and His Own. He also devoted what I regard as one of the most badly written of his polemical works, The Poverty of Philosophy, to an attack upon the works and ideas of Proudhon. And certainly that was a very unsatisfactory and unpleasant kind of debate. Now, there are very few Marxists then who have undertaken any serious analysis of precisely what the positions of the anarchists were. For example, over the last 50 or so years, some of the most biting and bitter criticisms of anarchist writings have come from Russia. And, of course, in Russia, over the last 50 years, the works of Proudhon, of Bakunin, of Kropotkin, and of Stirner simply have not been available in the universities. Many of the people issuing the attacks simply have not known what they were criticizing. But if the so-called Marxists have suffered from a non-reading of anarchist literature, the anarchist opponents of Marxism share an intellectual hostility to the works of Marx, which is almost universally based upon an ignorance and unawareness of what Marx actually said and what Marx actually did. The traditional anarchist image of Marx as a Hegelian lover of the state, for whom socialism and centralization were synonymous conceptions, is not only false, but it in fact runs counter to almost everything that Marx said, and I shall produce some evidence to show this. A second reason for the serious misconceptions in this debate between Marxists and anarchists is that there are many people who have called themselves Marxists who've taken it upon themselves to attack anarchism, and many people who have called themselves anarchists who have taken it upon themselves to defend anarchism, who are certainly not worthy of either of the titles. In the case of the self-styled Marxists, I'm referring, of course, to the advocates of Leninism, for whom socialism means capitalism with the state owning and controlling capital. And in the course of this talk, I intend to demonstrate the fundamental opposition between the Leninist and the Marxist conceptions of the state. For the moment, I shall simply say that the Leninist defense of state power and the anarchist critique of that defense constitute an important political debate, but it is not the debate between Marxism and anarchism. It is a debate between Leninism and anarchism, and these must be regarded as two quite different things. Similarly, when we talk about anarchism, I do not include in that everyone who calls themselves an anarchist. I don't, in other words, regard as an anarchist every person who decides to go through a period of momentary rebellion, every rock singer who decides to write on the back of his album sleeve that he has been an anarchist for 5 years and wants to smash the state, or every person who feels that by engaging in acts of unthinking terrorism, they are engaging in some sort of serious philosophical debate. When I talk about anarchism, I'm talking about the works written by the anarchists of the 19th century. I'm talking about the movement which has developed in the 20th century based upon those works. And there is a third area of confusion in the Marxist-anarchist debate, and it's not unique to the Marxist-anarchist debate. It goes on in almost every clash of ideas, and I am referring here to the tendency of political scientists, or people who are supposed to be experts in looking at ideas, they very rarely are, to see Marxism and anarchism purely in the realm of ideas. Now, to do this is profoundly mistaken, because political theories are not simply ideas. The combat between these ideas do not simply go on within a purely academic circle. They are not something which are simply the subject of academic scrutiny. The test of any idea of a political nature has to be its application to society, the extent to which it actually serves to say anything and describe anything and ultimately to change anything in the social setup. So it's necessary then to turn to these social problems which found proposed solutions in Marxism and anarchism. Now, in brief, I'll sum them up under 4 headings. Firstly, in the 19th century, there was the problem of capitalism as a new stage of oppression in the history of property relationships. Secondly, there was the problem of the state as a coercive and an oppressive force in society. Thirdly, there was the problem of changing society and the need for a mechanism of transformation which does not reflect the oppressive characteristics of non-revolutionary capitalist bodies. And fourthly, there is the problem of creating a free and harmonious society, or I should perhaps say a free and harmonious state of affairs, because there are certain anarchists, Stirner being the main one, who would deny that freedom or harmony are compatible with the existence of a society as such. Now, these were the problems which Marx and his anarchist opponents applied themselves to. In the mid-19th century, these were relatively new political problems for various reasons. Capitalism, in its industrial advanced form, was still in its historical infancy at the time when Marx and his anarchist rivals were facing each other. The feudal and mercantilist relationships of earlier centuries had given way to a new mode of wealth production and distribution. The social system, then as now, was marked by certain characteristics, and these characteristics in turn were marked by major contradictions. Now, the first characteristic of capitalism is the minority ownership of the means of producing and distributing wealth. In other words, the factories, the farms, the mines, the offices, the docks, the newspapers, these are not the possession of the entire community. They are the possession of a small capital-owning class. The second characteristic of capitalism is a logical consequence of the first one. If social wealth is monopolized by a minority, then the majority must be in a relatively, virtually propertyless position. And this is a position of the majority class in society, then as now, the working class. Those people who have nothing to sell in the marketplace but their mental and physical energy, ability to work. And as a majority class, the wage and salary earners, the people who produce wealth but do not possess it, were a relatively new social class in 19th century Europe. The existence of a mass urban working class, no property, nothing to do but go and sell its labour power for a price called a wage or salary was something new in 19th century Europe. But what then was a relationship, and is still the relationship, of these two classes under capitalism? It is an inherently exploitative relationship, with one class exploiting the other. Because the purpose of production under capitalism is sale on the market with a view to profit, and that profit goes to the capitalist owners. And unless it is profitable, then goods are not sold and needs remain unmet. Now, how is it that the capitalists obtain these profits? They obtain them by paying workers wages or salaries, it amounts to the same thing, which are always less than the value of the product of the workers' labour. And so the contradictions of the profit system were quite obvious to any critical observer in the 19th century, just as they are now. Just as in 1982, there is poverty alongside the potentiality for plenty, so there was then. There was luxury for parasitic owners of capital, and there was the most awful deprivation for the wealth producers, and so there is now. There was technological advance, but this was turned against the people who produced the wealth and turned them in turn into appendages to machines. So capitalism was and is a system worthy of the most vigorous hostility from that majority class which it oppresses, which it exploits. Now, I am not going to engage into in an argument about whether Marxists or anarchists were more hostile, more vigorous in their condemnation of this system. There are all sorts of people in the world today who are very critical of capitalism. You don't have to be a socialist to be in that position. They have regarded capitalism with hostility. But the historical perspective from which Marxists and anarchists criticise the system is an important dividing point. Because whereas Marx's entire critique of capitalism placed it within the framework of a materialist conception of history, saw capitalism as a stage in the evolution of property society, saw it as a mode of wealth production, and the anarchist critics, on the other hand, I would argue, failed to perceive it as such. They did not see it as a system. They did not place it within its historical framework as part of an evolutionary chain of systematic transformation from one stage of society to another, from slavery to feudalism to capitalism, through stages of wealth production suiting different social needs in line with different technological developments throughout history. Now, this is not the time, because I simply haven't got the time to do it, to go into Marx's penetrating economic analysis of capitalism. But those of you who have read any of Marx's economic writings, and in particular Capital, will have been struck by 2 points. Firstly, you'll notice its constant reference to the theory of history. Marx cannot handle any economic concept. He cannot look at anything without recognizing its transitory historical nature. For Marx, nothing was absolute. To defend or to condemn any social arrangement because it conflicts with moral or human invariables was regarded by Marx as unhistorical idealism. He rejected it. And secondly, Marx was a political economist, and the emphasis I put upon political, because to him every social event was political. Every social event involved a power relationship, a class relationship, and Marx never looked at an event as somehow having an existence of its own. Every event was perceived either by the exploiters, the exploited, the oppressors, the oppressed. Now, this was in marked contrast with the anarchist attitude towards the system which they were condemning. For example, Proudhon wrote, and I quote, "Justice is the central star which governs society, the pole around which the political world revolves, the principal regulator of all transactions. Now, Proudhon leaves his readers in no doubt whatsoever. Modern society, as far as he is concerned, is unjust, and therefore it must be changed. Now, to remedy social injustice, to abolish the violations of the natural law, to inaugurate a state of affairs which was just, was the classical 19th century anarchist objective. Now, Marx rejected this objective. He, on the other hand, rejected entirely the absolute yardstick of justice as a method of social criticism. He said that it was futile, it was unhistorical to look at something in society and say, that's unjust, that's unfair, that's unreasonable in itself. As Marx explains, he writes this in volume 3 of Capital, about his conception of justice, and I quote, "The justice of transactions which go on between agents of production rests on the fact that these transactions arise as natural consequences from the relations of production. The juristic forms in which these economic transactions appear as voluntary actions of the participants cannot, being mere forms, determine this content. They merely express it. This content is just whenever it corresponds to the mode of production. It is unjust whenever it contradicts that mode. Slavery on the basis of the capitalist mode of production is unjust. So is fraud in the quality of commodities." And because Marx realized that the concept of justice was just as historically transitory as the systems and the institutions which were being examined and measured against the yardstick of justice, therefore it would be historically naive and futile to condemn capitalism simply for being unjust. Now, let me assure you, this is no mere semantic quibble. I dare say, and the arguments about what Marx would or wouldn't have said, people have enough arguments about what he did say without what he might have said, but I dare say nevertheless that in common parlance to say capitalism is an unjust, exploitative, oppressive society is something Marx may not have disagreed with. It's a very reasonable point of view in common parlance. But as soon as we deal, as Marx insisted in dealing, and many of his anarchist opponents did, in definite philosophical terms, then the idea of an unjust society has to be rejected. Indeed, it is at the very centre of the division between Marxism and anarchists over the nature of social criticism and the method of social criticism. Because Marx's opposition to capitalism did not claim the validity of eternal justice. For Marx, capitalism was quite just on its own terms, from the point of view of the capitalist accumulating capital, taking surplus value, exploiting workers. This was justice. But as an economic system, Marx's criticism of capitalism was that it could not work in the interests of the majority. And it was on the basis of the class interest of the majority that Marx opposed the profit system. Now, the 19th century anarchists either lacked any conception of class, and this I would argue was certainly the case with Max Stirner and to a great extent with Bakunin, or they were anxious to recreate old, romanticized, semi-feudal class relationships. And this was a position that Proudhon was in a very great phrase in the Communist Manifesto. Marx said about Proudhon, he wants to create a capitalist system where the proletariat doesn't exist and the capitalist class does. He wants to defend the people who are doing well and wipe away the bits of capitalism, the majority class, where exploitation takes place. It was, according to Marx, a naive and utopian view of capitalism because they lacked a conception of class. Now, it would not be difficult to argue that the philosophical difference between Marx and his anarchist opponents was one between materialism and idealism. Marx saw capitalism as the root of social problems. It wasn't the root of every problem, of course. It wasn't nobody in their right mind would argue that capitalism is the cause of earthquakes or the occasional famines, but it is the cause of social problems which affect people in their day-to-day lives as a result of the social setup. The anarchists observed the problems and saw the system as a manifestation of these injustices. Now, in no way is this demonstrated more clearly than in the divergent views between Marx and his anarchist rivals over the state. The anarchists were united and still are united by a perfectly healthy hostility to the state machine. Government, laws, prisons, armies, judges, every single aspect of the coercive state was considered to them to be oppressive, indefensible. It had to go. Now, in the early 1850s in Germany, a group of anarchist thinkers, including Max Stirner and also Julius Falker, Ludwig Buhl and Edward Mayen, contributed to a newspaper which was called the Abend Post. And, well, I don't know if that's how it's pronounced in German, but that's what I'm going to call it. And they initiated the slogan in this newspaper, abolition of the state. Now, for Marx and Engels, this slogan was an example of their absurd idealism. Now, some people have drawn the conclusion from this, and you can understand them drawing this conclusion on a superficial basis, that if Marx and Engels opposed so vigorously the slogan, abolish the state, that somehow they were state worshippers. They were in favour of this strong, Germanic, centralised state that many anarchists have accused them of. Now, we've got to look at this. In 1850, Engels drafted a reply to the so-called Friends of Anarchy, who I've referred to. Unfortunately, it wasn't published in the journal that he intended it to be published in, and it wasn't, in fact, published until 1927 in a Russian journal. And in this, he considered the slogan, abolition of the state. And he says, for communists, abolition of the state makes sense only as the necessary result of the abolition of classes, with whose disappearance the need for the organised power of one class for the purpose of holding down the other class will automatically disappear. Now, in other words, Engels saw the state as an inherent feature of class society. To seek to abolish the state within the context of a society where real power was in the hands of a minority, an elite, would be to idealistically seek a society where economic monopoly was in the hands of a very small minority, and at the same time there would be political equality. This clearly would be a naive hope. Now, in a letter written in 1872 to a comrade of his in Milan, Engels makes the position very clear. And I quote from it. State power is nothing more than the organisation which the ruling classes have provided for themselves in order to protect their social privileges. But Bakunin maintains that it is the state which has created capital, that the capitalist has his capital only by grace of the state. As, therefore, the state is the chief evil, it is above all the state which must be done away with, and then capitalism will go to blazes of itself. We, on the contrary, say, do away with capital, the concentration of all the means of production in the hands of a few, and the state will fall of itself. Now, there are 2 points which arise from this statement of Engels. Firstly, that Engels, and Marx as well, saw the state as a product of class society. The anarchists, from the evidence of their writings, simply saw the state as an abstract injustice. It needed to be crushed. On that we would agree with them. It needed to be got rid of. They didn't want these coercive forces, but it was an injustice. They did not see the root of it. And it seems to me that while the Marxist critique of the state contained an indication of how to abolish it, in other words, by ending class society, the anarchist critique provides no logical strategic pointers at all. It simply leaves the state there as an injustice. And the second point that arises from this letter, which I just quoted, is that, and there were a number of other letters of this kind from Marx, I've quoted two things to you from Engels, I can refer you to others, is that they quite clearly disprove the assertion that Marx was somehow in favour of retaining a state machine. Both Marx and Engels saw the abolition of classes as the prerequisite for the inauguration of a stateless society. Now, there are many Leninists who might, of course, shudder at this sort of a claim, but the evidence is abundant in the works of Marx and Engels that they were in favour of a society without classes and without government. Now you may ask, how is it that such a society is going to be created? How did Marxists see it? How did the anarchists see it? A society we're talking about with no classes, with no state machine at all, no governments, no armies, no means of coercion. And I may well add, just so that any Leninists who may be present will really be shocked, that all of the evidence of Marx's writing show that he was talking about a society where there would be no monetary system, no wages system, a society with free access to all wealth. How the hell do you create this? Well, it's interesting to think that when you actually look at what Marx saw as socialist society, a society of common ownership and democratic control of the factories and the mines and the farms, the average Leninist, if they actually got around to reading Marx, which of course very few of them ever do, would read it and say, this man's a raving anarchist, throw away his works, and they'd be burning his books. As it is, of course, they have them up in pride of place in the Kremlin library. Now, in direct opposition to Lenin, Marx argued that working class emancipation must be the conscious political activity of the workers themselves. In other words, there can be no socialism without conscious socialists. It's a hard fact, but there is no other way. You either have fully conscious socialists, and then those socialists in a majority taking political action in order to displace the power in society of the small minority of people who monopolise industry and agriculture and the means of producing and distributing all the wealth, and taking it into the common property. Now, it must be said that the anarchists have always regarded this kind of political revolutionary strategy as being quite unacceptable. And there are several reasons for this. Firstly, there is the view expressed by Stirner in particular, that any organised movement involves the subordination of the individual ego to the collective cause. For Max Stirner, for example, the liberation of the ego from social domination is the highest form of rebellion possible. In fact, if you read this, it's one of those books, Stirner's Ego in His Own, where you read the first chapter and you think it's novel, and you read the second chapter and you start wondering, by the time, just about the time you're getting to the end of the book, you realise that you've been taken for a ride, and on any terms the thing's a lot of bloody nonsense by any standards. Now, Stirner's opposition to any kind of organised movement to change society is very pleasant and very libertarian, but what sort of rebellion is this going to create? Well, let us assume that Max Stirner, or one of his modern supporters, is addressing a group of starving peasants, or a group of homeless workers, or inmates in a prison. And let us assume that he says to them, look, you've got to keep your egos free from contamination by any movement or any organised political grouping, because that wouldn't be a good thing. And let us assume that they seek this individual egotistical liberation all on their own. Well, of course, the advice which Stirner had given them would be absolutely indistinguishable from the kind of advice that any member of the Conservative Party would give them. It would be, try to solve your problems as an individual. Forget about unity and doing something as a movement. Just try to change things on your own. Now, similarly, Proudhon, who believed that only moral renewal at the level of the individual could improve society, and that trade unions and strikes should be opposed. Proudhon held the view that strikes were barbarous and coercive and that workers should have nothing to do with them. All this is very well, but what are workers supposed to do? Now, the second anarchist argument against Marxism as a revolutionary strategy was based on the claim that it would lead to a tyranny of a vanguard over the community. For example, Bakunin, in his Statism and Anarchy, in quite an accurate prediction of what actually happened in state capitalist Russia after 1917, stated, and I quote, "The so-called people's state will be nothing but the despotic guidance of the mass of the people by a new and numerically very small aristocracy of genuine or sham scientists. Since the people are not learned or scientific, they will be freed from the cares of government and entirely regimented into a common herd. A fine liberation." Now, of course, the crucial phrase in Bakunin's prediction is the one, "since the people are not learned," because indeed Bakunin would be quite right if Marx, like Lenin, advocated a revolution enacted by a learned minority on behalf of the politically ignorant majority. But as Marx specifically repudiated such a political tactic, and as Bakunin's secret alliance within the First International advocated such a tactic, it would seem that Bakunin's criticism of Marx ought more accurately to have been made by Marx against Bakunin. It simply doesn't stand up. In fact, Marx's answer to Bakunin's criticism, some years ago, they discovered, Marx constantly discovering more and more notebooks and translations of works by Marx. Marx, who studied Bakunin's book, Statism and Anarchy, read that book in order to learn Russian. And he started copying notes out of that book in Russian into his own notebooks. And he accompanied it by a number of notes in German. And one of the notes, on that particular quotation which I read to you, I think is very relevant, because he says, "What does it mean, the proletariat raised to the position of the ruling class? It means that the proletariat, instead of struggling in isolation against the economically privileged classes, has acquired sufficient strength and organisation to employ general means of coercion in the struggle against them. But it can only use the kind of means which destroy its own character as a class. Thus, its domination ends with its complete victory, since its class character has disappeared." Now, what Marx is saying here is that the working class can only win the class war by dissolving itself as a class. The working class can only win the struggle against exploitation by seeking to be a working class, which by definition is an exploited class. Similarly, of course, the Socialist Party can only succeed in its political objective by removing the need for a socialist party. And the third and final anarchist argument against the Marxist strategy of workers organising for their own emancipation politically and consciously is the very reverse of the last one which I mentioned. Because just as Bakunin attacked Marxism because it was a recipe for anti-democracy, so there were other anarchists who regarded democracy itself as a form of tyranny. According to the people who hold this view, the will of the majority is a threat to the freedom of the minority. Now, of course, this is quite true if you look at it logically. If the majority has its own way and the minority disagree, then the minority's freedom to do other than the majority decision is under threat. It's denied. So, the will, for example, of a majority of people in this room to open the window may well be an affront to one single person sitting in the room who decides that they do not want to open the window. Of course, you have to make a decision. The only way you can reverse that way of dealing with things is either by having a fight and the person who is the strongest decides what happens to the window, or you say that the minority must always have their own way and you simply allow the person who is in a minority to decide what to do with the window. Democracy allows the will of the majority to take place. The will of a majority of impoverished people to have enough to eat or decent homes to live in or decent work to do is a threat to the freedom of the capitalist minority who decide that they will only allow commodities to be sold, they will only allow wealth to be consumed when it is profitable to them. Well, of course, the capitalist class is very philosophically sympathetic to this anarchist concern for the freedom of the minority, because historically speaking, they are a minority. They're destined to become a smaller and smaller minority. But for the majority class in society, such undemocratic scruples are simply a political obstruction. Well, I hope to have demonstrated 3 points in this talk. First of all, that the Marxist analysis of capitalism is based upon an historical perspective which the anarchists have simply lacked. Their failure to understand the system has left them in a hopeless position in relation to changing it. As Marx wrote to Anarchov in a letter in 1846, and this letter was a very lengthy one dealing with the ideas of Proudhon. It's probably the best Marxist statement on the ideas of Proudhon. He says, "A man who has not understood the present state of society may be expected to understand still less the movement which is tending to overthrow it." Secondly, I hope to have shown that Marx understood the nature of the state and advocated a stateless society. The anarchists have spent a lot of time throwing stones at the state while leaving out of the question the system which it exists to defend. And thirdly, I hope to have shown that Marx's democratic revolutionary strategy, which was rejected by the anarchists, even though they have had no serious political alternative to put in its place, that the alternative to the idea that the working class as a class must consciously, politically, democratically take action to run society on the basis of common ownership and democratic control, that simply has not, there's been no alternative. Now, after all that, Comrade Chairman, there are still those people who will say that Marxists and anarchists are, after all, after the same goal. And in conclusion, I want to dispute that claim by posing a very simple question to you. I won't give you the answer, I'll leave it to you. If there is a football match in which one side know what they are playing, they know that they're playing football, while the other side does not, in which one side plays as a team while the other side is more interested in the freedom of the individual, and each group person in the football match kicks a ball in their own direction according to their own rules so that they have the freedom of the ego, in which one side kicks the ball while the other side stands around arguing with the referee because they think he shouldn't be there, how many of you would conclude that there are both sides in the football match who are heading for the same goal? Of course, they're not. Well, yeah, the questioner mentioned the reference by Marx to the dictatorship of the proletariat, and he says, what was Marx's attitude and what is the Marxist attitude in relation to this term and the state? Now, I'd put it to you this way, that what Marx is referring to is the need for the political conquest of the state machine. I think that at every point, what Marx is saying is, look, at the moment you've got a dictatorship of a minority, you've got a dictatorship of capital in society, and that the only way in which you can counter that is by the majority class taking away political support for that minority and establishing its own political control over society. And see, I think what Marx is saying here is that you've got to get control of the state. In other words, you've got to get control of these, what are quite clearly coercive instruments, government, local and national, armies, police forces, courts, prisons, all of that. Because if you do not have them in the possession of the class which is going to take power, then you are going to have them used against you. It's as simple as that. But I would just say, I mean...
Do you believe the state was doing this?
No, what Marx...
You said to see an argument against the anarchists, that Marx was not saying he was doing this?
No, what I was saying was that Marx was in favour of a stateless society. In other words, that what Marx argued was for a society where there would not be a state. The argument that Marx advocated some sort of a workers' state or a people's state or a state which was going to run anything other than coercively is simply not true. What Marx did argue was that it was necessary to get hold of that state machine in order to, first of all, take it away from the people who had it to start with, and secondly, because let's face it, that's what a socialist revolution is about. A socialist revolution simply means people taking control of society who previously had been exploited and oppressed in that society, largely by the state itself. And that means having to be able to say, in future, these factories, these offices, these mines, these docks, these newspapers, they don't belong to you, they belong to us. They're not controlled by you, they're controlled by us. You don't make the rules, the majority does, the community does. And for that to happen, you can't leave political power in the hands of a minority. So what I'm arguing, and I persist in arguing it, is that there is no contradiction between using the state as a means of dismantling a society where coercion is necessary and wanting to set up a coercive society. They're different things.
Is the state not by definition coercive?
Yes.
And so therefore, if you take the power of the state, it's going to be still good.
Yes. The state has to be coercive.
It's going to be the Wilson one class, presumably exploited class.
Yeah, but you see...
I mean, the problem comes like, who decides and who is going to be the exploited class? I mean, who actually is going to decide? That's a pretty big problem. I mean, who's going to say who?
Well, no, you see, what Marx was...
Where it starts going up there.
Yeah, well, look, what Marx...
People deciding, oh, those people are exploiters, and they must be exterminated. Oh, those people are acting revolutionary or whatever.
Well...
And that seems to be a big problem.
Yeah, but
Could you either speak up or let Steve repeat what you said, because I don't
I'm just putting my point, I'm sorry.
Speak up, they can't hear you.
Yeah, I mean, on this point where you say who's going to decide who the exploiters are and so on, it's not simply a question of identifying any group of people and saying they're the exploiters, they're the exploited. This is a position in history that we're in. We're here now. We know that there is a minority exploiting class. We know there is a majority exploited class. We know this because all the evidence is there from examining society. Now, what we're saying is that we've reached the point in history where we do not need exploiters or exploited. We don't need leaders or led. We do away with it. But you can only do away with it by taking away from those people who have used the machinery of coercion. That machinery has to be taken from them. It has to be put into the hands of the majority and used as a means of registering the decision of the majority that they no longer want a society based on exploitation. See, in a socialist society, we're talking about a society where every person has consciously decided, or a majority of people have consciously decided, they want a non-exploitative society. We're talking about a society where there is no working class and capitalist class, where there's no ownership, there's no selling, no buying, there's no possession of factories or of mines or of docks. So the whole basis on which exploitation can take place will not exist, because exploitation isn't simply an injustice which arises out of people's temperaments or exploitative natures or exploitative conditioning. It arises out of specific social characteristics. Capitalism has to be exploitative. A society of common ownership could not be exploitative because people would be conscious. They would have created that society. If people in this room decide to create a socialist society, if millions of people around us decide to do it as well, and we're in a majority, we will know what we want. We'll want to produce food. We'll want to produce clothing. want to produce houses. We will not want to exploit people. There'll be no need to do it because cooperation will have been consciously determined to be better than coercion.
Can I just ask, who is going to decide who is counter-revolution?
But I mean...
No, but that is a pretty fundamental question.
All right, well, let me answer it. You say, who is going to decide who is a counter-revolutionary? Well, obviously, if you mean who's going to decide who opposes this revolution, well, the first people who are going to decide are the people who bloody well oppose it. They'll decide for themselves. In other words, if you have a society where the majority of people want socialism, they want common ownership, they want democratic control, and a minority don't, and they say, no, we want private property, we want to go and sell ourselves on the labour market, or we want other people to sell themselves on the labour market so that we can exploit them. Well, if they say that, or people say, we want to go and get killed in wars, or we want to have wars fought over our markets, if they're in a minority, then the majority can say to them one of two things. The majority can either say, look, sorry, but socialism and capitalism are mutually exclusive. They're incompatible. You can't have the two, and we decide we want socialism. Or alternatively, I suppose the majority could turn around to this minority and say, look, if you're so keen on having capitalism, well, we want to run a free society. You go and find a corner of the world somewhere, the Falkland Islands or something, and you go and set up capitalism there and go and kill each other and have inflation and unemployment and all the other things you favour.
Just say that you say they're mutually exclusive. But Marx worked about two stages of the socialist society, the first and the second, lower and higher. And in the first stage, they're not mutually exclusive. There is no separation. They're dialectically progression. As you were talking about theory of history.
Well, let me just make...
In that easy area, who decides that?
Actually, the debate is very interesting, and it might have been better if we'd have organised the debate, if you'd have liked that. But under the circumstances, I do think that we should give anybody else at this point who wants to ask a question.
Let me just answer that question.
Yes, of course, and I'll repeat, our friend at the back raised the question of the transition. Was that right? Between the stages? Yeah.
I mean, on this point about the two stages, what I'd say to you is this. First of all, Marx is writing in a different historical period altogether. Marx is writing at a time when the whole problem of doing away with capitalism and establishing a society of common ownership was much, much greater as a problem than it is now. And because Marx was not a utopian, he was a scientific thinker, he was forced into the position of saying, look, in order to establish this new society, we're not going to have everything in one go. Well, what I say to you is the fact that Marx said that in the 19th century, very different things would have to be said now. But even now, the whole nature of precisely what happens between where we are today and where we would be in an advanced socialist society has to be seriously examined. It has to be questioned. But of course, conditions now are very different from conditions in the middle of the 19th century. But the second point I want to make to you is this, that and if I am accused of giving the wrong impression on this, I would apologise for it, or I would want to alter it. And that is, I haven't come along here, and I hope the Socialist Party would never end up in a position where it's simply repeating parrot fashion the words and ideas of Marx. As far as I'm concerned, what Marx said in the critique of the Gotha programme, this party would quite specifically dissociate us from. All the talk about labour vouchers, all the talk about the dictatorship of the proletariat, a lot of what I would consider to be ideas quite incompatible with other of Marx's writings, and which have been seriously exaggerated, inflated, distorted by many Leninist so-called advocates of Marxism, I would repudiate entirely. So we certainly don't stand by every dot and comma of Marx. And quite frankly, when Marx talks about the lower stage of socialism and the higher stage of communism and all the rest of it, I would simply say, in the same way as many anarchists would say, well, we agree with that bit of Proudhon, but we don't agree with that. Or we agree with that bit of Bakunin, we don't agree with that. I would simply say that when it comes to Proudhon and Bakunin and the rest of them, that there is so much of it that you would have to disagree with in order to hold a reasonable political strategy, that I think you should throw the lot of it out. Whereas with Marx, the amount which you would have to disagree with in order to hold a scientific analysis of society would be an a negligible proportion of the vast writings of Marx.
I'm going to ask somebody over here to ask a question, only to keep a balance. Don't think for one moment anybody wants to restrict or confine. I mean, you come back again as much as you want. But in the meantime, we'll just try to even things out over here.
Well, Comrade Chairman, what I've got to point out, it arises out of the sort of mini debate that's taken place between the speaker and the questioner. This question of seizing the state apparatus is rather unfortunate as far as we're concerned, because quite a number of people, including Leninists, I would think, would regard it as a kind of operation that takes place, for example, in the so-called Third World, where the local bourgeoisie use the kind of methods that the capitalist class in the state apparatus are always using, and that is coercive force. But, of course, the contribution that the Socialist Party has made to Marxism, in our view, I think has been ably demonstrated by the speaker in relation to pointing out that Marx lived at a time when such ideas may have appeared to be valid. They most certainly aren't now. And our proposition is that before you can abolish the state, before you can capture the state, you first of all have to have a majority of socialists. And of course, ironically, if you look at the logic of this, it would appear that having got a majority of socialists, the abolition or the capture of the state apparatus may appear to be superfluous. Well, of course, in one way, I suppose you can say that that's correct, but nevertheless, obviously, actions have to be taken, and actions have to be seen to be taken, which of course is another parliamentary cliche. But the fact is that unlike Leninists, and well, I'm discounting anarchists altogether, because anarchists, of course, don't pretend to be Marxists, unlike Leninists. But the fact is that we take the view that you can't have socialism without having socialists. And the position is that all other political parties and their members would refute that, would deny that, and consequently it poses a sort of ambivalence. We maintain that that is the position, and of course this capture of the state apparatus could only come about when you've got a conscious working class who knows exactly what the position is and takes the necessary action to do it.
Well, we'll regard that as a question. Another one here.
Yeah.
You don't want to say anything about it?
I always thought that when Marx was, when the people referred to the stages that Marx was supposed to mean about going from capitalism to socialism, would be where Marx wanted capitalism to become established, so whereby you had the electoral machinery whereby you could set up socialism. You couldn't have socialism until you had the democratic process. I thought that was, I thought that was the stage at which Marx referred to, going through that change from feudalism, which still existed in parts of the world at that time where capitalism had reached its advanced stage in Europe. I thought that was a transition that he was actually referring to, that part of transition in part of the world. And also a second question.
One at a time, you confuse. I would have. No, I'm
back.
trying to help you. So the first question is about the establishment of democratic procedures. Yeah. Okay?
Yeah, I mean, you're right there, but the thing is, of course, Marx was faced with a basic logical problem, really. What do you do if a majority of people want to set up a socialist society in a world where the means of production have not yet been developed to the point where everybody can have, in other words, it's all very well advertising in the brochure, free access, no money, no wages, then you get a bloody thing and you can't set it up. So Marx was faced with that problem. Now Marx, if this would have been Robert Owen or somebody else, they would have said, well, never mind, we'll sort it out after the day sort of thing. But Marx was looking at this scientifically, and he was saying, look, you will have to, he was clear, you would have to have a certain amount of rationing. People wouldn't have what they want. And he went into other things. Now, whether you think Marx is right or not to have done that, certainly the political use that has been made of that, particularly by state capitalist defenders, has been tremendous. It's been to their advantage. But of course, that was Marx's problem. Here he was, needing, in a sense, to see capitalism develop, and at the same time recognising that it was ripe for revolution for socialism. And this was a problem. But of course, it would be the most totally anti-Marxist approach for us to say that what Marx wrote in 1840 or 1850 or 1860 applies today. Because the whole essence of Marxism was that Marx said, look, I'm laying down general principles of society. This is a general analysis. You've got to now apply that. In fact, Marx went as far as to say in different countries, different people will have to apply what he's saying in different ways.
I know the party always has hypothetical questions. I'd like to raise a hypothetical question. Now, as we know, that capitalism developed at that time, beginning of the 19th century, roundabout in Europe. And, the majority of the world was still feudal, and gradually it's developing to the same extent as Europe and the West. Would it be hypothetical to assume, or practical to assume, that when socialism before it comes about, you will have this sort of same type of isolation of ideas, whereby in one part of the world, hypothetically in England, we all became socialists and decided to abolish the state and the armed forces and all the rest of it. And you had, say, in the United States, a minority, but a quite sizable minority, who still maintained political power through the state. Then would not the state have to be used by the socialists against this sizable minority in another part of the world who still wanted to maintain capitalism? Would you see this uniformity of ideas going throughout the world, just to say capitalism?
Well, I think you've got to make a distinction between, I think, your correct point that there is not a uniformity of ideas all over the world. That's right. And the other equal error, which would be to assume such a divergence of ideas throughout the world. Let's be quite clear about it. If we're talking about a majority of socialists in Britain, when we're talking about a majority of socialists in Britain, we're not talking about people throwing away their Labour Party rosettes and joining the SDP. We're not talking about that sort of earth-shattering bloody rubbish. We're talking about serious, radical changes in the way people see society. Now, of course, this can only take place, if you think about it, on a worldwide basis. Look at the growth of trade unions. Look at the mass communication in the world today. But in one sense, you're right. If there was a section of the working class in an area of the world who are in a majority, and the rest of the working class weren't, the only thing that could be done, in the same way as the position we're in here in a minority, is to simply gain a position where the working class, as a majority, can change society. You can't do it any other way. But of course, you think what position millions and millions of workers would be in if they were socialists. Think what they would be able to do. Think of the resources at their command. Think of the radio stations and television stations that could be set up and sending messages across to other parts of the world. Think of the use of trade unions. Instead of this going around and sending a few leaders abroad and shaking hands every few years, people would be able to use these international conferences to get across real ideas. So when it comes to it, whilst you're right that we mustn't assume a kind of a uniformity about capitalist development, where every single part of the working class is thinking the same thing at the same time. At the same time, we mustn't go too far the other way and assume that the working class in Britain are going to be ready to establish socialism. And in America, they're sort of deciding whether they're going to vote for Jimmy Carter or Ronald Reagan. It's simply not going to, it's inconceivable that things can develop that way. If you look at it on a rather more localised scale, you'll see the absurdity of it. Imagine what's going to happen. Let's say you've got two branches. What's the nearest branch to here? Croydon branch and South West London branch. South West London branch is putting up candidates in the election and getting elected by a conscious socialist majority. Down the road in Croydon branch, they're getting about 30 bloody votes. Well, come on. There's going to be that would be a very strange thing to foresee, wouldn't it? Obviously, you're going to have a kind of a similarity of intellectual development which has happened up to now, and it would be inconceivable for it not to go on happening.
Could we have another question from our... Yes? Come on, I promise you.
I'm wondering about, you said that Marx felt the working class had within the consciousness to create a socialist society. A lot of anarchists and a lot of Marxists, well, in your terms, Leninists, would say that if you read things such as Das Kapital, and especially Engels' dialectic of nature, and especially in that, the dialectic portrayed by Engels denies the working class and anybody with any chance of spontaneity of consciousness, which would be necessary for the social society. Which you said that Marx instead. And I'm just wondering whether, you can really say that Marx did believe in working class consciousness.
Sorry, I didn't catch it. What?
Well, I think...
Can you say it?
Well, I can only paraphrase it unsatisfactorily. What he says is that if you read many of the works of Marx and Engels' Dialectics of Nature and Marx's Capital, he says that it doesn't seem to give the impression that the working class is capable of spontaneous consciousness, and many anarchists would criticise Marx for that.
I mean, you could read Marx and come up with very determinist theory of revolution.
Yeah.
Especially, his theory of histories. Very determinist. If you just read feudalism, primitive communism, feudalism, capitalism, communism, then you'd be denying such things as the Russian Revolution and the Chinese Revolution at the start. Yeah. Both of those came out of societies which were not capitalist. Lenin and Mao tried to justify them as being in the capitalist order.
Well, let me say this. I think anyone who's read Capital, and of course most of its critics haven't, would find it absolutely impossible to argue that Marx was an economic determinist. I think if you read certain extracts from Marx and Engels, you would find it very easy to think that they were economic determinists. Engels wrote this in a letter towards the end of his life, that he and Marx went so far to stress the economic basis of society that he said, we probably, I forget the phrase he used, we overestimated it, we overemphasised the economic origins. I don't think if you look at Volume 1 of Capital, you'll find that that's the case, because I think it's a very balanced work which makes very clear it's anything but deterministic. And of course many of the secondary writers who've written about Marx have clearly been very crude economic determinists. And you're quite right, that if you are a very crude economic determinist, then the Russian Revolution or the Chinese Revolution, also, in fact, more or less anything that comes out of as a bit of an exception to the trends of history at that time, will be looked upon as being something which is quite inexplicable. However, you shouldn't throw out the Marxist historical sort of baby with the economic determinist bathwater, because when it comes to it, the theory which Marx was actually putting forward, if you look, for example, as the most coherent and also it happens to be the briefest statement of historical materialism that I know of, which is Marx's preface to the Critique of Political Economy, right, you'll find in there that it is certainly anything but a determined economic determinism. What Marx says is that he puts it both ways. He's clearly dialectical about it, that the economic conditions determine the way people think, but the way people think determines the economic conditions. It works both ways, but of course he's looking for a basis in it. Now, when it comes to looking at the development of Marxist historical thought, if you look at the analysis of the Russian Revolution, which this party came up with at the time, in 1917, 1918, and throughout the 1920s, it was anything but basic economic determinism. It recognised that within capitalism there were various ways that it could take place. Even when you talk about Marx's historical stages of feudalism and capitalism and communism and the rest of it, even there, if you actually read what Marx wrote on this, Marx, for example, wrote that there were two forms of what you might call feudal society. There was classical European feudalism, and there was something else which he called Asiatic despotism. A lot of people are researching into what Marx meant by that now. It's a tricky concept. It's a very fluid sort of concept as well in some people's writings. So when it comes to it, Marx was very clear that you don't just put a label, get out your stamp and say, right, where are we, 16th century feudalism, you have to look at it. But if I make one other point for you, if you come back on this, Marx started off, some people say too much has been made of this, I don't think it has. Marx started off in the Hegelian philosophical school, and he was brought up entirely, and so were many of the anarchists, Stirner being one of the young Hegelians, in the Hegelian philosophical attitude. Now, one of the problems which Marx had, and was that he approached a work by Hegel called, what was it called? The Philosophy of Right. And Marx wrote a critique of this. It was his first major political writing, you might say socialist writing, in 1843. And in this critique of the Philosophy of Right, Marx said, look, every time I look at what Hegel's writing about the state and about civil society, what he seems to be saying, and this was a whole trend of philosophical thought going right the way back to Kant, and it had a very important influence in German philosophical rationalism, was, look, they are saying here is a state, here are classes, here is a government. These things all stand on their own. And what Marx was saying is, and this is why, this idea of turning Hegel on his head, let's look perhaps at what these are the reflections of. And so what Marx started to do was to look beyond these manifestations of the system to try to find something which united them, which caused them to exist. Now, I would say this is not a Marxist thing in particular. It is a basic criterion of scientific thinking. If you think scientifically, you are bound to ask yourself the question, whenever you see an effect, because everything around us is an effect, what is its cause? What originated? What is at the root of that? Why is this happening? You can look at this discussion we're having now. Why do you think what you think? There must be many reasons for it. Why do I think what I think? You have to go back to the causes. We might both be wrong. But of course, whether we're right or wrong doesn't make a lot of difference. Much more interesting to discuss, why do we think as we think? What is it that's motivating us to hold the positions we hold? Where do they come from? What are they reflecting in ourselves and in our environment that has created these ideas? I think that's what Marx was doing. And I would say that if you turn around and say, well, look, if someone is a king, he's in favour of the power of the monarchy. And if someone is a starving peasant, is in favour of having enough food to eat, well, you might call that economic determinism. I would say that as someone who's actually gone out and got my hands metaphorically dirty in the historical field, trying to discover things about history, it's a very sensible starting point. If you see someone who's a king, you assume that he's not that concern about feeding poor people. And if you see someone who's poor, you assume that he's not all that interested in the divine right of kings. And you start out by looking at things that way. And normally, it might be called economic determinism. I would say it's starting from the economic base of society and expanding and recognising that beyond that base of society, there's a vast superstructure involving, judicial, cultural questions, which every Marxist has to look at. Otherwise, I would say he's not a Marxist at all.
Another question.
No, that's okay. I was just going to ask why I was the son of petty bourgeois himself.
Why would
Interested in the emancipation of the working classes.
Ah, yes.
Very good question.
No, it's okay.
Excellent.
I think it's a rhetorical question.
No, well, what I understood you to say was, how could it be that a member of the petty bourgeoisie, like Marx, could be interested in the abolition of the bourgeoisie, right?
Yeah, it's a
Go on, off you go.
I think it's a rhetorical question. I'm not going to spend any time answering it, except to say, I'd only say one thing about it. My examination of political theorists, you will almost always find that the best political theorists of any idea you'll ever come across hold absolutely no serious reason why they ought to hold it. If you look at it, I mean, it's very difficult. If you make a study, do you know what? I was looking at a document a couple of years ago produced by the Department of Education and Science. I think there's something like 890 research historians in Britain researching into the English Civil War, and most of them are trying to find out, all being given grants by the government, well, it's a perfectly reasonable thing to do, all trying to find out why it is that the wrong side supported either side in the English Civil War. It's quite true. People very often do things for motives which are against their own interests. That's one of the classical ironies, historical ironies of capitalism. I mean, people looked at capitalism, the people who are out marching in the street demanding, how dare people attack the monarchy or how dare people attack the House of Lords. The House of Lords and the monarchy, they wouldn't, they'd go and emigrate to the Caribbean if there was any chance of that happening. It's members of the working class. So, of course, the motivation for political action is itself a fascinating area of Marxism. And again, something which quite post-dated Marx. Marx's investigation and Engels' investigation of the whole psychological conditioning of capitalism was quite frankly more or less non-existent. And the area of research that started up since then is very interesting. And, just because it's happened at a time when Marx wasn't around doesn't make it any the less valid or in some cases any less Marxist.
And the next. Come on, yes.
I can see lately that we're getting more and more aggressive society. In what relation do you think that socialism and anarchism have developed? Have they become stronger or weaker, or are the ideas pretty evenly balanced?
That's a good one for you.
The extent to which Marxist and anarchism as ideas have become stronger or weaker. Well, I'd put it to you this way. I think that at the time when Marx was writing, there was a far greater clarity in the intellectual debate than there has been for a long time after that. So I think one thing that can be said about old Marx is that he did his homework. I mean, before he attacked something, he read about it. He knew what it was about. How he did it is quite incredible. Maybe that's one of the reasons why it wasn't a member of the working class who was in that position, because it takes a lot of time and a lot of study. Or when I say wasn't a member of the working class, what I should in fact say wasn't a conventional member of the working class and having to go out for most of his life and work in conventional circumstances, although he did work as a journalist and he certainly was hard up, which is a qualification for being in the working class. I'd say in the same way with the anarchists. I think to a great extent, it's not true of Bakunin, who was never a serious thinker. It's not true of some of the others, but it is true of, say, Proudhon. Proudhon was a very, very capable writer. I hold the view, this is purely a personal view, that Proudhon was such a good writer and had such a major following, although I think a lot of his ideas were nonsensical, that he caused Marx to overreact. And when Marx wrote The Poverty of Philosophy, I think he wrote it in terms which aren't like most of his other writings, because I think he overreacted and didn't write it as capably as some of the other works, but that's a personal view. But I think that what's happened since is that there's been an enormous distortion. I mean, these days, the qualification for being a Marxist is that you look at what's going on in Russia and prefer one form of capitalism to another. The qualification for being an anarchist very often is wearing a badge, or if you sort of buy two records by the Sex Pistols or whatever, you become an honorary anarchist sort of thing. Well, I think this is it's a reduction. It's to bring down. It's a diminution of political debate, and in that sense, it's a bad thing. But what I would say is that Marxist ideas are to a great extent being that there is an opportunity to read them, much greater than there was a long time ago. There's once a time when it's far harder to get hold of Marx's writings. It's very easy now. They're actually being produced by what I would consider the enemies of Marx, by the Russian government, by the Chinese government, in very cheap editions, and people can read it. Although I must say, as someone who sort of works in the area of education very closely related to Marx, that if you look at the university syllabuses, the kind of things which students in universities have to study in relation to Marx is most of the stuff which he either wrote before 1845, like the 1844 manuscripts, and secondary works about Marx. People will tend to read about Marx, and next year, no doubt, BBC Television is going to make a documentary about it, and ITV will make a documentary, and all the radio stations about, the Marx centenary. And of course, a lot of what will be in there will not be seriously analysing Marx, but it will be, quite frankly, a distortion. I don't know whether I should say it or not, but I spoke to somebody who was talking to a BBC producer about a programme they intend to make next year about Karl Marx, and he said, well, I'm interested, what's the SPGB got to say? Very good. And the first question he asked was, are there any members of the SPGB who are relatives of Karl Marx? Because we'd like to speak to them. Well, we told them about Harry Young, but they didn't want to interview. So, quite frankly, this is the kind of level which these things are taking. It's very superficial, whenever you see any extracts or programmes about Marx on television, you sort of see some peculiar bearded figure. I won't go into that in too great detail, but you see sort of people coming on, and it's a kind of a caricature. And when it comes to it, the whole area of political thought is becoming very... is reduced to a great superficial level.
Next question.
Yeah, go on. It's not so much a question, as...
Well, could we start this discussion? Yeah, no, we'll start the discussion. You can go ahead. 5 minutes.
Yeah, okay. You said about the anarchist movement, right? You quote people like Proudhon, Bakunin, Stirner. I'm an anarchist, right? And I think myself that obviously there's lots in Bakunin, Stirner, and Proudhon to criticise. And I think it's pretty easy made. But on the other hand, you haven't really criticised basic anarchist principles of what Marx said himself, that the freeing of the workers is the work of the workers themselves. Right? Not of a political elite, party bureaucracy, or trade union bureaucracy, or trade union elite. This is what the anarcho-syndicalists realised at the turn of the century, and they realise now, still in Spain and in Britain, believe it or not, that you need things like direct democracy, rotation of positions, secretariats, etc., etc. These are the things you don't find in Marxist parties, whether they're Marxist-Leninists or whatever. And I think that on the whole, that the anarchist movement shouldn't be judged just by philosophers. We're not a party which refers to philosophers all the time, saying, party of people, relate themselves directly to 19th century philosophers, many of whom were imbued with anti-Semitic, racist, authoritarian ideas of the times in the 19th century themselves.
Do you want to answer one at a time, or...
Well, let me just make that...
We'll answer each one in turn, right? We've got a little bit of time.
Well, let me just refer to it. Look, let me say to start with, I don't want to, you see, necessarily when you're talking about two different ideas and you associate with one rather than the other, it seems to be a kind of a combative approach to it. You're saying this is right, that is wrong. I don't wish to do that in the sense, so I think that when it comes to it, of course, you say, I don't attack the basic anarchist principles. I don't attack many of the basic anarchist principles because I happen to share them as principles. In other words, if you say to me, you want a society without a government, well, I don't care whether you're an anarchist or a socialist or what label you take at that particular point. In that particular sense, you want a society without a government, you want a society without laws and police and all the rest of it. I share that view, of course. And indeed, you know, one would be very narrow-minded to say that somebody who wants that kind of thing is in the same position as somebody who clearly is opposed to it, somebody who's in Leninist, vanguardist party, the Tory party, the Labour party, Liberal, SDP party and the rest of it, who say we've got to have governments, we've got to have police, we've got to have laws, however they want to organise them, is clearly in a different position to the one that you're in. But what I have done, and also I take your point about 19th century philosophers, clearly if you don't associate yourself with 19th century philosophers, then of course that means that you don't have anything at all to do with the things that they said. You only have to say, I disagree, I don't stand for what Proudhon said, and I say whatever I say about Proudhon can go over your head. It's not an attack upon you. Of course, people like myself who say, I am a Marxist, I therefore have to accept that if somebody comes along and says, well, Marx said this, that or the other, I've got to talk about it. I put myself in that position. But if you don't wish to, that's all right. When you say, however, that I haven't attacked the basic ideas of anarchism, I would argue that I did. I think that in the time that I spoke, I hope you wouldn't see what I said as purely a list of Proudhon said this and he was wrong and Bakunin said that, or taking quotes. I don't think any of the quotations I took were in any way out of context or chosen as, you know, I mean, as you said yourself, one could easily take quotations from Proudhon, which would make him look like a very unpleasant sort of person. But that's not my purpose. What I did do was I made three basic criticisms of anarchism. One was that I don't think anarchists understand capitalism as a system. And I think it's fundamental that if you want to get rid of the system, you have to do it. It's not an academic exercise. I'm not saying, in other words, you know, that you sit around and hold economics classes about the laws of value forever and a day. I'm simply saying that the nature of exploitation has to be understood if you want a non-exploitative society. And what I said is that I think that there is a tendency amongst anarchists for that criticism not to take place. Secondly, in relation to the state, I said that I think that anarchists have failed to understand the problem of the state. And I think if you go into the 20th century anarchist movement, the direct action and the anarcho-syndicalists, I think have had serious errors of political judgment about what the state is all about. I mean, when you talk about the anarcho-syndicalists at the turn of the century, and I can tell you now, because this party was around at that time, that was one of the unusual things that has been going for a very long time. And this party at the turn of the century actually produced what I consider to be some of the best articles it's ever published, dealing with this anarcho-syndicalist movement, and pointing out, I think in terms which were correct, why it is that through the syndicalist movement, through the ideas of syndicalism, whether they were, you know, Daniel de Leon or the French syndicalists or any of the other people, and I'm referring to names because obviously the easiest way to associate an idea is by somebody who wrote about it or said something about it. It pointed out why they were, in the end, erroneous, why they couldn't succeed. And I think there's been a lot of evidence to show that they didn't succeed. But another point, and the third point I made, was in relation to revolutionary change. I was arguing that you've got to do something in relation to getting control of the state. You've got to do something in relation to taking away power from the minority and putting it in the hands of the majority. Now, you are quite right to be cautious about that idea, because, you know, anything which involves any sort of... It's tempting to say any dealings whatsoever with the state have got to be ignored. You don't like it. It's a dirty thing. Keep away from it. But on the other hand, there are times when that cannot be done. In the same way as trade unions. There's a very interesting passage, I won't read it, from Marx. He writes I think, very funny letter, which is about the movement of the anarchists at the time, abstention from politics. During the First International, many of the anarchists had a slogan called indifference to politics. It was a Russian slogan. And Marx wrote a very funny thing saying, oh yes, we mustn't join trade unions because we're against the wages system and therefore it would be terrible to contaminate ourselves with arguing about wages and so on and so forth. I thought he made a very good point in writing that. Now, when it actually comes to it, I think they are points you've got to answer, not in any particularly argumentative way. I just think if you want to change society, which is what we're involved in, then you've got to actually have a way of doing that which is going to succeed rather than fail. And that's why I think I did get to the point of attacking the principles of anarchism. But I want to pick you up on one point. When you say that political parties cannot be democratic and are not democratic, I don't know whether you say they cannot, I simply say to you, look at the Socialist Party of Great Britain. There's one thing you can say about it. You might say it's completely wrong, its theories are all wrong. It certainly hasn't got very far in bringing about a socialist revolution and all the other things. One thing you can say about it is democratic. Every one of its meetings is open to anyone. Anyone's allowed to speak in them. The executive committee meetings which are held are open to the public. The executive committee is elected yearly by every single member of the party. Anyone can stand for it. Anyone can attend it. All the minutes are open. If you want to go and read the minutes of what happened here last Tuesday night, you can go upstairs and you can take as many copies as you like and read them and study them. So it's all open. It's all democratic. Democracy can work within a revolutionary organisation. Sometimes it stops people from wanting to join it and involve themselves in it, because there are a hell of a lot of people who, they want to be leaders. They don't want to be revolutionaries. But when it comes to it, there is a democratic political party. I would argue that we do have a serious way for trying to change society, and that our criticism of anarchism is not simply one which is put there for the sake of argument or for the sake of what is commonly called sectarianism. It's being argued because we believe that we've got a correct series of principles about what society is, how it can be changed, and what it can become. And what we would appeal to people to do is to look at them and to at least give some serious thought to the criticisms of anarchism that you'll find in our journal and, going back in the pamphlets and literature over the years.
Next contributor.
Will the speaker give his observations on the proposition that it must seem as clear to anarchists as to Marxists that if there is to be an overthrow of capitalism, an overthrow of the state, it must effectively be done by what Engels called the vast majority. But to go on from that and to take up the point which was made by a question at one juncture, with socialism, who will decide? Not only who will decide things, but how and in what manner will things be decided? Will they in fact be decided by what the anarchists dub the mark of the illiterate?
Very good. All right, on the mark of the illiterate.
Oh yes. I wanted to refer to something, in fact, and I just found it here. On the second point, what I did want to raise, and I think it's a valid point, is in relation to authority in society. One of the arguments which anarchists have traditionally put is that you can run a society without any form of authority at all. Well, in one sense, in the sense of an imposed authority or the notion of authoritarianism, this is absolutely correct. But of course, I want to read, because I think he puts it better than I can, from a thing which Engels wrote on this notion of the abolition of authority in society in 1870, which he wrote in 1872. And he asked the question, will authority have disappeared in a socialist society, or will it only have changed its form? Well, I'll read this. I'll apologise in advance for the length of it. It's not very long. Let us take by way of example a cotton spinning mill. The cotton must pass through at least 6 successive operations before it is reduced to the state of thread, and these operations take place for the most part in different rooms. Furthermore, Keeping the machines going requires an engineer to look after the steam engine, mechanics to make the current repairs, and many other labourers whose business it is to transfer the products from one room to another, and so forth. All these workers, men, women and children, are obliged to begin and finish their work at the hours fixed by the authority of the steam, which cares nothing for individual autonomy. The workers must therefore first come to an understanding on the hours of work, and these hours, once they are fixed, must be observed by all, without any exception. Thereafter, particular questions arise in each room and at every moment concerning the mode of production and distribution of materials, etc., which must be settled at once on pain of seeing all production immediately stopped. Whether they are settled by decision of a delegate placed at the head of each branch of labour, or, if possible, by a majority vote, the will of the single individual will always have to subordinate itself, which means that questions are settled in an authoritarian way. The automatic machinery of a big factory is much more despotic than the small capitalists who employ workers ever have been. At least with regard to the hours of work, one may write upon the portals of these factories, "Leave ye that enter in all autonomy behind." Now, what I think he's saying, and it's a very reasonable analysis, is that if you're running an advanced industrial society where you're going to produce wealth and distribute it worldwide, you have got to accept decisions which are going to have to be made on a broad basis, democratically arrived at by the participants in production and distribution and consumption, of course. That has got to be done in a socialist society. And therefore, democracy imposes its own kind of authority, and efficiency imposes its own kind of authority. And the idea that you do away with that and simply have a kind of an autonomy of the individual, I don't agree. But of course, on the point about the anarchist statement, about the ballot, the cross on a ballot paper being the sign of the illiterate, apart from it being, as far as I'm concerned, a perfectly accurate statement of the way in which capitalist elections take place at the moment, more can be said about it, that it's a very inefficient way, very often, of making decisions. The idea of people going into a polling booth and not having any chance to consult with the people who are proposing things and make decisions in a sign of atomised way, away from everyone else, is, on the whole, it's quite suitable in many ways for capitalism. I don't think it's the most suitable way to make decisions at all in a socialist society. I would think it would be much more technologically advanced ways of people communicating. And what's more, I think that on many issues in a socialist society, people simply wouldn't want to participate in decision making, even though they'd have the ability and opportunity to do so. They would simply want to leave it to people to make those decisions, not for any particular sinister purpose or apathetic purpose, but simply because in a society it's impossible for every person to be intimately involved in every decision that affects them. Because a good example of that is the Socialist Party itself, which, although organised democratically, doesn't by any means involve every person in every decision which affects a party, because many people are prepared not to involve themselves in them. On your first point about the need to have a majority before socialism can be established, because that's the fundamental rule of Marxist understanding of socialist revolution, that you cannot have change to socialism without socialists. You can't run a socialist society, where, according to the Leninist idea, you have a socialist revolution first and then you tell the working class about it afterwards. It's sort of like having a pregnancy after the birth. And quite clearly, in a socialist society, from the very start, the people who run that society will have created that society, and they will run it because they created it.
Next one.
Can I make a point?
Yes, of course.
I just want to reinforce what Marx said in case our friend at the back there thought that it was never the position of either Marx or Engels that a majority consciousness was possible. Engels did in fact quite specifically say, and I think it was in the same correspondence that Steve quoted earlier, that the establishment of socialism must be the work of a politically conscious majority, and that this would require a process, a long process of education. So not only did they believe that it was possible, but their final view that it was absolutely necessary.
But coming on to the anarchists in general, I've always found it particularly frustrating. We used to have a lot of debates with anarchists years ago. There don't seem to be many around now. But I always found that there were sort of two sides to the anarchists. That they used to rave on about oppression and all this sort of thing. And when you actually put the question to them, how is it that workers are exploited, they always had to take up a Marxist position. I mean, you always got that from anarchists, so they went around attacking Marx right, left and centre, but on all the useful things they had to say, and especially when they had to deal with real situations in present society, for example, how are workers exploited, they had to fall back on a Marxian explanation of how workers were actually exploited under capitalism. I always thought. And for example, the anarcho-syndicalists, the most useful things they say come straight out of Marx about working class exploitation and that sort of thing. But just as Steve said that the anarchists never were able to put the state in its proper historical and class perspective, even in terms of their own aspirations, this notion of individuality and freedom, they never put that in its right social context either. Because if you think about what it is that constrains the freedom of individuality in present day society, most importantly it is your class position. If you have the economic pressure on you to go out and sell your labour time for wages, that is the most immediate factor in your life situation which constrains your freedom. You are forced by your existence as an economic category, a member of the working class, to sell yourself for wages. So these are the economic and historical factors which constrain your freedom, and you cannot consider individuality just as an abstract idea. You have to give all the reasons why individuality is constrained and that sort of thing. And the other, I mean, if you're a very, very wealthy person in class society, then obviously your options on individuality and freedom are much wider, much broader, and they are much broader by virtue of your economic position in society. So it's even when you come down to the notion of individuality and freedom, it's Marxism that makes sense of this whole thing. And ultimately, I've always thought that Marxism is all sorts of things. Politically, it's a class position, but ultimately, it's the credo of the individual, because it places the development of individuality and all the possibilities of individuality and freedom on a practical basis. And these are the sort of differences that we used to have with anarchists. Can I just mention a thing about freedom in relation to socialism and production views? We've still got to accept, Steve mentioned the tyranny of industrial processes and this sort of thing. Your freedom will be constrained under socialism by a very, very important historical factor, and that is the pressure of necessity. You do not have absolute freedom even under socialism. For example, if your social priorities are that you want every human being to have enough food to eat, and we presume that that's what the social priorities are, that no human being will die of starvation, and then you have a practical task of increasing the food supply. Now you have no choice about this. There is an immediate pressure of necessity placed on you to organise social production democratically so as to increase the food supply. And that is an absolute pressure of necessity on you that you have to accept even within production. You know, you just can't go off and create, say, beautiful landscapes or something like that. You've got to get the food produced because people are starving. And that is a pressure of necessity that will be placed on you, even in socialism and production to use.
And the next...
Can I just say about
this
Marxist theory of consciousness? I mean, it's been said here that Marxists believe the working class can free themselves from capitalist society. I think that it's very wrong just to say that Marx said that, because I think on that point Marx is very debated, and surely that's the cause of so much debate. So it just leads Lenin to say that come up with the theory of trade union consciousness, leads George Lukács to come up with the theory of ascribed consciousness, to underlie the whole theory of the party. Kautsky to come up with a theory of socialism only coming from professional revolutionaries and having to be injected into the working class. And so, I mean, to say that Marx was simply saying that the working class can free themselves is completely wrong, because Marx is very debatable. And I think what's been done here is you're picking out certain bits of Marx and putting them against what certain bits of the anarchists have said, and knocking one down with the other, without really. If you're going to read Marx, or if you're going to read the anarchists, you must try and read them and see what they've said as a whole. You can't, if you start picking out certain bits that suit your line of argument, and that is an authoritarian, dictatorial way of reading, and knocking down other people's arguments.
Well, let me reply to that.
The time is running on, and we don't want to detain people. Are there any other contributions?
Could you just...
No, I'm trying.
Don't waste time by giving us an advert of what we're going to talk about next.
No, I'm not. I'm just going to say, could we begin to think about winding things up now and take any further contributions and let Steve, unless you're going to insist that he...
Marvellous example of anarchist authoritarianism from his instructions to you that you must not make any announcement.
No, that's all right. But now, if you would like to insist
Excuse me, you're wasting time here, this man.
Oh no, we're not all that short a time. In fact, we're running quite well.
It's about the third time you said that. When John's asked the question, you said he could.
Oh, well, in that case, I'll ask Steve to reply to that.
Sure, actually.
Yeah, well, let me reply anyway. I think it's, to go into the 3 points as I understand them which you've made, I think it's rather unfair to suggest, as you have, that I've selected... well, in fact, you said that you shouldn't read only parts of what the anarchists wrote and select parts and so on. I think that's not true. I think that the particular quotations I gave from the anarchists are quotations which many anarchists would give. I mean, for example, when I quoted Proudhon saying that justice must govern society, I think that most people who've read Proudhon and agree with what he says would say, yes, that's right, and so it should. I think practically every quotation I gave, as I said earlier to somebody else, if I wanted to look for the things in Proudhon or in Bakunin which were clearly anti-Semitic, which were clearly undemocratic, there'd be plenty of them. I mean, there's so much of it that I could have spent time doing that. I didn't. In the same way, when you say that what I say about Marx and consciousness is untrue, it's selective, I'll put it to you this way. I think there's a certain amount of validity in the criticism you make, insofar as that I think Marx held different views at different times in his life, and that I don't happen to believe that you're right in what you say about the Marxist view of consciousness. I think that the Marxist view of consciousness was something which was consistent in Marxist writings. I say that, in all honesty, I've got no axe to grind. I'm not don't get anything out of being a Marxist rather than an anarchist or indifferent. As somebody who's read the views that Marx put down, and I think that even in a time when I think Marx was politically wrong in arguing in favour, as he did, of the possibility of violence as a way of establishing a socialist revolution and insurrection as a way of establishing a revolution, whilst I think Marx was wrong in having held views that certainly could be described in that way, I don't think he ever held those views because he didn't believe in the possibility of working class consciousness. He held those views, as a matter of fact, because he believed, quite rightly at the time, that the working class was, in many cases, a minority class. It was in a position in many countries where it lacked also the political access to political power, which in many of those countries it now possesses. So for those reasons, I'd say that. On the point about Marx and consciousness, I'm quite prepared, if you're serious about it. I could provide you with numerous references to Marx where he quite clearly, rightly or wrongly as you may see it, holds the view that only by its own efforts can the working class establish a new society. For example, Marx was asked to draft the preamble to the rules of the International Working Men's Association, the First International. And the major point he wrote in that was that the emancipation of the working class must be the work of the working class itself. In 1879, Marx sent round and Engels sent round a circular letter to their to members of the German Socialist Workers' Party, and in that letter, I mean, I've got it here. I'm not going to quote from it now. He concludes by making the point: look, Marx, we have always held the view that the only organisation we can support is one which takes a view that the working class must emancipate itself, and that this isn't going to be carried out by, I can't remember the exact wording, I think he says something, philanthropists or intellectuals from above. Very clear. In fact, when you come to look at what Marx said on consciousness, I'd say to you this. If you think that the quotations I've given from the anarchist writers are in some ways out of context or designed to distort what they were saying, then I'd say it's up to you. I know you don't walk around with the collected works of Proudhon, not many people do, but I'll say to you, okay, you can always contact me here. If you write to me at the Socialist Party of Great Britain and say to me, well, that's wrong, and here's the evidence, I would be obliged, and I saw other members of the Socialist Party would agree, we'd call a public meeting to retract. They would say, what a lousy speaker, what a charlatan who has to rely upon distorting quotations. And in the same way you can contact me here if you can do it, if you can produce for me the evidence of the fact that Marx didn't hold the view that the working class can consciously emancipate itself, I'd like to see it. It'd be an interesting thing. But I don't believe the evidence is there, and it's notable. You haven't actually cited any. You've said it's there. You've made a reference to Engels' Dialectics of Nature, a reference which wasn't backed up by what Engels actually said. You made a reference to Marx's Capital. Well, there are a lot of words and pages in Marx's Capital. Again, you haven't told me what was there. So I'd like to know it. But what I would say, in conclusion on this point, is that if there's one thing that we can say as Marxists, is that we don't have to depend upon the writings of Marx in order to argue the fact that the only way you'll get a socialist transformation of society, the only way you'll actually establish socialism, is when the majority of people understand it and want it. We can say that now, here in 1982. We don't need Marx to tell us that. We know that if the Socialist Party of Great Britain, a relative handful of the population, went out tomorrow and said, we're going to establish socialism and tell the working class about it afterwards, we wouldn't stand a chance. Why wouldn't we stand a chance? Because the majority of workers support capitalism. Passively or actively, that's a hard fact. I don't like it. I'm sure you don't. It's a hard fact. We know very well, in relation to the state is only powerful because the working class is weak. Can't be helped, but that is a fact. We know that if a starving person goes into a shop tomorrow morning and steals a loaf of bread, it'll probably be a worker who will call the police. It'll be a worker in the police force who locks him up. It'll be a workers who carry on. And when the next election comes, it'll be workers who will be electing the government to run capitalism. And it'll be workers who will be rejecting the ideas of socialism when they are put to them. After all, we socialists, we've done it. We've got up and said, look, here's what we stand for. Here's an alternative. And workers haven't voted for it. Now, that is not proof of the fact that the working class cannot become conscious. It's simply proof of the fact that the working class at the moment has not reached a level of consciousness where it recognises that the only object in society worth fighting for is to abolish the working class as a class, to get rid of class society altogether. Now, the way to do that, we would argue, is that you put socialist ideas to people. There's no other way. You relate those ideas to their experiences. You invite people to join a socialist party. You ask people to join with you in taking political action. But at the end of the day, that is what we can do. You can have a strike. You can have a demonstration. You can have an insurrection. At the end of the day, if the majority of the working class support capitalism, you're stuck with it. That's the position we're in. So the position that we're putting, and this is a position that Marx put, is that the working class can become conscious, and that the only way the working class can become conscious is by, first of all, understanding what capitalism is, and understanding what socialism could be. And unless those two factors are there, you can't have a serious and revolutionary political change. But capitalism provides...
Are you going out
No,
fighting relationships?
no, you see...
You're not injecting socialist ideas into the world.
But if we could inject socialist ideas in the working class, we'd do it. You know, you'd make it compulsory on the national health. But no, but you see, look at it this way. You see, when you say, do socialists go out and inject or put these socialist ideas to the working class, what are socialists? Socialists, I mean, look, let me give you an example. One day, let's take you for an example. You wouldn't, perhaps, I don't know whether you'll call yourself a socialist or not, but you're not a member of the Socialist Party. You're not going out doing this injection operation. But if tomorrow you were, you wouldn't stop being a member of the working class. You know, I mean, otherwise that would be the best way of recruiting people to the Socialist Party if it was a way out of the working class, but it's not. So people join the Socialist Party have still got to go out to work. They've still got to do all the other things being a member of the working class. So what we are saying, when we say that the emancipation of the working class has to be carried out by the working class itself, is that the Socialist Party is a working class organisation. Members of the Socialist Party go out and say to people, look, you're in this position, we're in this position. No one's saying follow us or let us elect us or give us any power. What the Socialist Party is saying is use the Socialist Party in your own class interest. We reckon we've got ideas which are in your interest. I mean, it'd be rather foolish of us if we said, well, look, we know we've got ideas which are more conscious than the ideas which other people hold, but we mustn't say that out of some sort of political modesty. Obviously, we've got to make it quite clear. We think the ideas we hold are correct, and the ideas that most workers hold are not correct. And we say that. And we say to people, if you can show to us why supporting the Labour Party is correct, rather than being a socialist, you tell us.
But at the moment, those members of the working class who don't hold the socialist consciousness, what sort of consciousness have they got?
They've got capitalist consciousness.
Have they got false consciousness?
Well, if you want to call it that, yes.
Consciousness, on the side consciousness.
And some of them have got trade unionist consciousness, some of them haven't even bloody got that. I mean, the fact of the matter...
Surely that, therefore, they have not, I mean, they haven't got socialist consciousness.
No.
And where, well, this socialist consciousness is only going to come from you.
Of course it's not. Socialist consciousness comes from capitalism. I mean, look, you don't need a...
I mean, that's proved by the fact that we're living in 1982 and this still hasn't been done.
Oh, well, I mean, come on.
It relates trade union consciousness with socialist consciousness. I think it's related to trade union consciousness with socialism.
Well, it is related to some extent, isn't it? I mean, how does trade union consciousness arise anyway?
I'm using Lenin's terms, trade union consciousness. And I think you hold that you're not saying so, the same thing.
Why would we hold it and not say so?
Because it's not right to be a Lenin. In your terms, you slag Leninist off and say you don't think it's correct to be a Lenin.
Well, the reason, I mean, well, grant us a certain amount of honesty. The reason we don't think it's right to be a Leninist is because we disagree with them, not because we agree with them. I mean, if we agreed with them, then we'd think it was right to be a Leninist.
I don't think your theories of consciousness and Lenin's theories of consciousness are in any way different.
Well, let me explain why they are.
Why you didn't know that Lenin's theory of trade unionist consciousness?
Oh, well, I'll do...
Consciousness according to the cash.
Well, I'll do that if the chairman will allow me. Well, look, it's a simple thing. At the moment, you've got a society where the majority of people are in the working class. Now, capitalism forces members of the working class to do things in their own defence. Very often, in other words, the class struggle, put it this way, takes place regardless of workers' consciousness of its taking place. I mean, I'll give you an example. I know people who are the most out-and-out Tories you'll ever meet. If they find that somebody in the office down the road has got a wage rise and they haven't, They can forget about Toryism. They want a wage increase. I mean, many of these, heroic NHS workers we're seeing about now, who the sort of the latest heroes of the left. Many of the NHS workers, many of these nurses are people who, they support the most backward political ideas. But at the same time, the class struggle goes on regardless of voluntary decision to enter into it. So in other words, workers have to form trade unions. I mean, many of the workers who formed trade unions in Britain in the beginning of the last century, they held all sorts of religious views, all sorts of phony views. Didn't make them bad trade unionists in precisely the same way as it doesn't have to make somebody a bad trade unionist in Poland if he's a Catholic. You can be a trade unionist and hold all sorts of funny views. Now, because of that, trade union consciousness, as Lenin argued, is simply a consciousness of saying we're arguing about the rate of exploitation. In other words, to be very simple, the workers produce all of the wealth in society, generally speaking, and the machinery that produces that wealth. And because the workers produce a wealth in society, that wealth takes a form of values, and some of those values go back to the working class in the form of wages and salaries, and most of it, or rather another part of it, I should say, goes to the capitalist class in the form of rent, interest and profit. And what the trade union struggle is about, it's a perfectly legitimate struggle, is over how much of the value workers get and how much capitalists get. It's about the rate of exploitation. It doesn't challenge exploitation at all as such. Now, workers enter into that all the time. Now, what Lenin said, and incidentally, I don't regard Lenin as being a sort of an evil person for thinking this. I can understand why he thought it. He held the view that he was in Russia at the beginning of the 20th century, an extraordinarily backward country with a working class of under 3 million, out of a population of over 200 million. And Lenin held the view that, look, how are you going to expect these working class, many of them working 12, 14 hours a day in factories, how can you expect them to become socialists? He said, you've got to have a vanguard implanting consciousness into these workers and doing things on their behalf. And that was the whole Bolshevik program. Now, what the Socialist Party says is not that that is somehow a morally incorrect statement, or that necessarily it was historically incorrect. It was possibly quite true that the working class in Russia at the beginning of the last century were very backward and unlikely to reach a high level of socialist consciousness at that time. But what we're saying is more in the order of a fact than a value judgment. We're saying you cannot have a society running in the interest of the whole community unless a majority of members of society decide to do it. You cannot, in other words, impose democracy upon the majority. By definition, a democratic, free, harmonious society has to be the work of those people who are going to benefit from the democracy and the freedom and the harmony. It has to be produced by those people. So what the Socialist Party says, when we were formed in the turn of this century, there were all sorts of other organisations. There was a Social Democratic Federation. They were saying, what you've got to do, yes, you tell workers about socialism, but you can't do that straight away. You have a list of reforms. You get the workers to support these reforms, and then afterwards, when you've got them in the door and in a party for a few months, you say, incidentally, we stand for a moneyless, wageless society and all the rest of it. Then there was the Independent Labour Party, and they said they were going to go into Parliament and enact this reform and that reform. The Fabian Society were going to chip away at capitalism, and as Keir Hardie once said, socialism was going to come like a thief in the night and nobody would notice it. Then there was the various anarcho-syndicalists, and some of those were arguing in favour of what was then called industrial unionism, the idea of having one big union and you have a general strike and you bring down capitalism. Then there were other syndicalists who argued in favour, and particularly in the second decade of this century, in favour of organising, similar political uses for trade unions. All of these people putting their argument. What we said, and we would argue that it was in direct line with what Marx said, is that you can only establish a socialist society when the working class, who are the victims of a capitalist society, decide that they want to get rid of it. Now, that doesn't mean that the working class now has a socialist consciousness. But what is a socialist consciousness? It's simply the ability to do what I've done and what, let's say, give you the benefit of the doubt, you're doing. Maybe you've done it. You've looked at society, you've said, look, I'm being exploited by it. I don't want to. Why should I go out and do a job and make profits for someone else? Why should I have the government? Why should I have all the rest of it? You've come to this conclusion. You want a society without the wages system. You don't faint or have a shock when somebody mentions it to you. You're in favour of a moneyless society where everyone has free access to wealth. You don't think it wouldn't work because of the greedy man or the lazy man or the selfish man. Well, if you can understand all this, then the rest of the working class can.